the human condition is a strange one. More often than not, we go through our lives not seeing what is directly in front of us. Looking back, I can honestly say that Terry Daniels was a good friend of mine. It's one of those idiosyncratic circumstances where it should have been obvious to me from the beginning, but personal resentment and envy would obscure the truth. To say the least, Terry Robert Daniels was an interesting guy. He was the embodiment of the stereotypical hippie type. If you saw him, you'd probably think he was struck by lightning and experienced some freak occurrence where he time-traveled back to 1969, hitched a ride to Woodstock, tripped balls on LSD before being zapped back to the present with a newfound sense of enlightenment. He would often prattle off meaningless platitudes, such as,
"Mother Nature is the one true God, and we must live to honor her."
Blah, 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 fucking tree-hugging asswipe. Terry eventually found a short-lived group in Gainesville, Florida, who called themselves the Nature Children. To his credit, Terry did have a charismatic personality to match his outdated style. He had this gift for reeling in lost souls. It wouldn't be much of an exaggeration if I were to compare him to Charles Manson, minus the murderous elements. It was actually quite impressive watching him bullshit other people into a similar state of mind. He was the kind of guy who flourished in the college environment's naivety. Students, especially girls, wanted to be around him, and he, more accurately, his penis, was happy to oblige. I think it would have made a fascinating study of cult mentality. Personally, I was never one to plug into a power strip. I've always preferred to have my own outlet. I refused to buy into the idea that a single ideology or belief system has all the answers to the conundrum we call life, and I've never had an issue with my own insignificance. I think that was the reason that I was one of only a handful of people that Terry actually respected. He never talked down to me as if I was one of his hopeless cronies, nor did he ever try to convert me. He knew better. There was an unspoken understanding between the two of us. Terry knew that I knew, that he didn't believe a word of the sanctimonious bullshit that left his mouth. He was just a gifted manipulator, killing time and getting laid. I guess it was just nice to communicate with someone with some semblance of independent thought after being surrounded by gullible idiots all day. Good old Terry. That's what I used to say to him every time I would see him roaming around campus in his multicolored button-down shirts and his John Lennon T-shades. I think I'm getting ahead of myself here. In 1996, I was a film student attending college at the University of Florida in Gainesville. I had always considered myself a fairly intelligent individual with a firm grasp of reality, but despite all my knowledge, this world chewed me up and shat me out, and I floated down to the very bottom. In other words, I lost my job for being smarter than my boss, was tittering on the edge of dropping out, and was living out of my car. I would spend what little money I had at the Purple Porpoise downtown trying to find my lost hopes and dreams by emptying every bottle of bourbon I could get my hands on. While I was going through my own crisis, Terry's falsehoods eventually caught up with him when his group of moronic misfits started expressing interest in weekend trips to the Everglades. Florida is probably one of the best places for worshipping Mother Nature, if you were sincere about it, that is. Allow me to inform all of you that good old Terry, the so-called man of nature, had never stepped foot into the humid, mosquito-infested swamplands of the Sunshine State. He was just a clever bullshit artist from Boston whose knowledge extended to what he read in books. When Terry vented to me that his followers wanted to go on a little adventure, he didn't seem very enthusiastic about having to put his money where his mouth was. I could see the disheartened look on his eyes behind his orange-tinted glasses. I remember saying to him, "You can't be a hippie without having at least one orgy in the woods." I was joking, of course, but I think Terry began scheming on how he could convince his followers that orgasms would bring them one step closer to true enlightenment. I fail to remember how many trips Terry had taken with the Nature Children before I was approached by the prodigal son himself and was asked to tag along as a cameraman. I would have turned him down immediately if I wasn't at such a low point in my life. Having access to the school's film equipment was about the last thing I was useful for at that point, and the $200 he offered me sealed the deal. He assured me that this was strictly about filming the natural beauty of the Florida Everglades for a documentary he was working on, and this wasn't going to be some crazy sexcapade. I was a bit disappointed, to be honest. When it came to top-of-the-line film equipment of the late 90s, the film department at UF fell tragically short. The department head, Mr. Coughlin, saddled me with this severely outdated handheld dinosaur. When I informed him what I needed it for, he chuckled and told me that an American film crew had once used the camera during an excursion into South America in 1979. The story goes that they planned to make a documentary about the indigenous cannibal tribes of the Amazon, and they disappeared shortly after they set off into the forest. 2 months later, a rescue team discovered their skeletal remains and the camera, along with several cans of film. There was a debate among the studio executives who syndicated the project on whether or not they should still broadcast the footage recovered from the cans. However, after viewing what was on the film, they decided to liquidate everything. A year later, the camera was sold in an auction and somehow found its way to the University of Florida's film department. The camera utilized 16mm film stock that would need to be switched out frequently. Luckily for me, I had prior instruction on operating Super 8 cameras, which basically worked the same, and the department had the necessary equipment to convert the footage onto videotapes. So there wasn't an issue there. The only downside was that I would have to lug around a backpack full of film cartridges. To give you an idea of how primitive this thing was, each film cartridge contained a 100-foot spool of film. Roughly 3 minutes of footage, 24 frames per second with no sound. Given the camera's morbid history, I decided to use it anyway. This was back when I didn't believe in bad omens. I had no inclination that this journey would be the thing that would change my life forever. I came out the other side as a new man, with a rejuvenated appreciation for being able to place my hand on top of my head and feel hair between my fingers, and not the smooth, blood-soaked surface of exposed bone. On April 22nd, 1996, Terry, myself, and 2 of the nature children all boarded Terry's cream-colored 1969 Volkswagen van and began the long 6-hour drive to the Everglades. I was grateful that only 2 of Terry's idiot acolytes were joining us for this trip. The first was a 6'5" skeleton named Thomas Schroedsman, who had the personality of a plank of wood. He had long, unkempt hair that fell to his waist and wore a thick pair of glasses powerful enough to reflect the sun's ultraviolet rays. The second was a girl you'd find in the holding cells of the Gainesville Police Department on any given Saturday night. Her name was Lizzy Mercer. She was an attractive girl with long blonde locks and a nice midriff that she didn't mind showing off, complete with a pierced belly button and a tattoo of a lemniscate just above her right hip. I knew trouble when I saw it, and Lizzy was the very definition. Much like Terry, Lizzy was an interesting character. She was someone fixated on chasing things, Terry being her latest obsession. She carried this cognitive dissonance wherever she went. She hated technology but used a Nokia cell phone, thought vehicles should be outlawed but drove around her ex-boyfriend's elevated Ford Bronco that did more than its fair share of polluting the atmosphere. Lizzy was so up her own ass that I'm surprised she could even sit down. On the surface, she was nice enough, but I knew that it would be wise to avoid any philosophical conversations with her during the long ride to the Everglades. The road trip was a combination of extended periods of boredom with frequent stops at shady gas stations so Lizzy could empty her bladder. I buried my nose into the camera's operation manual while listening to a mixtape on my Walkman. Between songs, I overheard Terry's conversation with Lizzy and Thomas from the back seat. They were talking about how the worship of Saturn is often misunderstood, and that the planet's satanic affiliation is a misnomer created by the Catholic Church. I still have no fucking idea what they were talking about, and frankly, I'd rather do a crossword puzzle than be a part of that discussion. I remember asking Lizzy at some point about the tattoo on her hip. She explained it symbolized the universal ad infinitum.
I think our species is insignificant compared to the infinite nature of the universe. Most of us are too stupid and obsessed with our own lives to see the bigger picture. Some people see me as a reckless slut, but the truth is, I just don't care about consequences. Because in the end, we all turn to dust, and we're reborn elsewhere on this vast plane of existence.
I instantly regretted asking her, but her answer made sense in a weirdly fucked up way, and explained a lot about her personality. Nevertheless, it made me ponder about humanity's inability to grasp its own awareness, and that might be why our very essence is a recipe for chaos. An interesting concept, but I also factored in that Lizzy may have been popping shrooms on each of these little pit stops, then came to the reasonable conclusion that despite the infinite nature and unmatched wisdom of the universe, we still have to live out our lives among our fellow human beings and have to deal with the consequences of our actions. Before embarking on this trip, Terry had contact with someone whose identity is still unknown to me, although I have my suspicions. This mysterious individual provided Terry with directions to an abandoned gate that led to a section of swampland east of Everglades City, near the Big Cypress National Preserve. We got off the interstate before reaching the Everglades City exit and made our way through at least 10 miles of winding back roads until Terry's van came to a stop outside a rusted gate enraptured with ivy. The nature children exited the van while I stayed behind to prepare my gear. After shouldering my backpack of film reels and closing the van door, I joined Terry and the others by the gate. Thomas and Lizzy were determining how best to maneuver past the gate without destroying Mother Nature's gift. Unfucking believable. With a camera in hand, I casually walked past the two dipshits and lifted the gate with my free hand, then pulled it towards me, separating the ivy and creating an opening big enough for the four of us to walk through. I looked over my shoulder with a smirk. "Problem solved, comrades." Thomas and Lizzy gawked at me, slack-jawed. Terry was doing a very bad job of hiding the amused look on his face. Terry squinted his eyes as he held back his laughter, before he reached into the breast pocket of his sky-blue button-down and removed his T-shades. He made sure to step in front of his disciples before placing the shades over his eyes, then gestured towards the now opened gate.
Well, guys, shall we?
The four of us made our way down the dirt path beyond the gate and entered a kingdom of forest and swamp. A thick expanse of cypress trees and wildflowers lined the trail before eventually opening into a colossal marshland that went on for as far as the eye could see. Even I must admit that the uncultivated grounds did seem to radiate some hidden power beneath its ancient waters. I switched out the film reels like clockwork as we made our way further into the marsh, the camera capturing footage of leopard frogs jumping from lily pads and disappearing into the murky waters below, and white-tailed deer suddenly raising their heads before darting off into the surrounding tall grass, where the golden orb spiders patiently waited for the next fly to be trapped by their webs. We spotted several alligators moving through the shallow waters on either side of the trail. More were seen basking in the sun on a nearby embankment, their black eyes following us as we walked past. My traveling companions were awed at the sight of the massive reptiles. Bloviating about, they were the natural beasts of the domain. I seemed to be the only one apprehensive about being pursued by them. The gators practically surrounded us. A dreadful knot formed in the pit of my stomach. The potential danger that we put ourselves in hadn't dawned on me until that moment. Terry didn't inform me that we would be traversing through an undoubtedly restricted area of the Everglades infested with alligators. Had I been privy to this, I would have borrowed my father's .38 special before setting out. There was no way this place was patrolled by park rangers. If any of us were to be severely injured from a nasty fall, or if the gators decided that college students were on the menu after all, we would be fucked. but something was unsettling about the gators keeping their distance. It was as if they knew something that we didn't. After about an hour, a tree line came into view, and we all agreed that once we entered, we would find a place to rest for about 30 minutes before continuing. I looked at my watch and noted that it was 2 o'clock. I made it a point to inform Terry that we should start heading back to the van no later than 4. The last thing I wanted to do was wander around the gator-infested swamps in the dark with a bunch of clueless hippies. As we grew closer to the trees, a bizarre sensation overcame me. It was like we were a quadruple of asteroids heading straight for the sun. Since I couldn't quite pinpoint what exactly caused my trepidation, I decided to keep it to myself, at least for the time being. Shortly after entering the forest, we continued down a dirt path until we reached a clearing of short grass and bedrock. We then saw something about 50 yards to the left that had no earthly business being there. An old, decrepit, wooden church. The dreadful sensation returned in full force as I gazed upon the ancient structure in the middle of the swamps. The others gleamed with excitement upon seeing this.
Far out! You gotta get this on film, man!
Terry said as he removed his T-shades. He then turned to the others.
I'm gonna go in for a closer look. You guys in?
Before I could respond, Lizzy chimed in.
Oh, for sure. Maybe there's a good place to sit down inside so we can light up this joint.
She held up a fresh joint between her fingers. Thomas only offered a goofy chuckle and nodded his empty head. After I switched out the film reels once more, we all approached the old church. The harsh elements of the swampland had battered the old building into a state of severe decay. Green mold clung to its exterior like cancer, and the foundation appeared to be sinking into the ground. When my camera lens scanned the dampened ruins, something finally registered to me. There wasn't a single crucifix in sight. Perhaps this place wasn't a church after all. I aimed the camera upwards at what was mounted above the entrance, an antlered deer skull. If this was, in fact, a house of worship, the congregation may not have been praying to the good Lord above. The visage of the mammal had further justified my nagging fear. I was not one for superstition, but something told me that we needed to haul ass back to the van. I lowered the camera and turned around to face Terry. I don't have a good feeling about this. I think we should turn back now. Terry gave me a puzzled look.
I don't think we have anything to worry about. This place looks abandoned. Besides, we walked all the way here and...
Terry's words were cut off by the sound of something rushing through the air. We both turned to see Thomas, who had his back to us. He appeared to be nodding his head sporadically, going up and down, then side to side. He raised one of his stringy arms and placed a hand on his forehead, as if he was feeling for something.
Tom, you okay?
Terry said in a concerned voice. Tom then turned to face us, and our jaws dropped as Lizzy let out a terrified shriek. The shaft of an arrow was sticking out of Tom's forehead. His eyes rolled back into his head as he fell to his knees before the rest of his lanky body slumped to the ground. The force of his collapse drove the protruding shaft further into his brain, causing the arrowhead to puncture through the back of his skull. My worst fears were realized once I saw the forest itself descending upon us. I immediately dropped the camera and began sprinting back towards the trail, sending a fresh wave of sweat down my already soaked body. Terry, we need to get the fuck out of here, now! I shouted as my feet pounded across the damp earth and the film reels clacked against my back. I looked behind me to see if Terry and Lizzy had taken off in a different direction. They were still standing by the church, holding each other, as what looked like several moving bushes surrounded them. Before I could call out, I tripped over a protruding stone and lost my footing, sending me crash-landing face first into the bedrock. I heard Lizzy scream over the ringing in my ears as I tried to lift myself back up. I raised a hand to touch the side of my head and saw fresh blood falling from my fingers. My vision then went blurry. The last thing I saw was a deer skull staring down at me before I lost consciousness. An undetermined amount of time relapsed. When I woke, I could not see a damn thing. I felt myself being carried over someone's shoulder as voices communicated in a language unfamiliar to me. The tone was harsh and throaty, teeth clicking with each syllable. I was placed against a rough surface as a rope was pulled tightly across my body. The smell of burning meat invaded my nostrils. The blindfold was finally removed from my face. The first thing I saw was the wooden roots beneath my dangling feet. After some stagnation, I finally looked up and was met face to face with the hollow sockets of a deer skull, its antlers towering over me. A muffled voice bellowed from beneath the skull. The antlered man then moved to the side, and the full magnitude of my predicament was finally revealed to me. I was bound to the trunk of a massive tree that overlooked a lake. To my left was a bonfire on the shoreline. A human figure was suspended above it as innards oozed from an exposed ribcage and fell into the raging flames below. It was only when I observed the arrowhead sticking out of the back of the slumped head that I realized that it was Thomas. The poor bastard. A short distance away, Terry was sobbing on his knees with his hands behind his back, tears rolling down his face as he watched what remained of Thomas plummet into the fire. Lizzy was nowhere to be found. All around us stood several standing bushes. It was only when one of them moved that I realized these were no bushes. They were men. They all wore the same concoction of leaves and moss. The one that donned the antlered deer skull was the only one distinguishable from the rest. He also carried a massive scepter in his right hand with a collection of teeth and bones dangling from a surmounted human skull. He then raised the massive staff into the air and faced the others. The declaration was followed by a symphony of clicking teeth from the camouflaged herd. It appeared that the antlered man was the ringleader of this deranged swamp cult.
Terry, what the fuck is going on here?
Terry looked up, his mouth quivering.
Oh God, I'm so sorry, man. I didn't mean for this to happen.
It was odd to see Terry in such an erratic state, even under the circumstances. I had always known him to be an intelligent, charismatic guy who never lost his cool and could talk his way out of anything. However, his charm would not serve him here.
Where's Lizzy?
I asked. With Lizzy being the only female in the group, I feared the worst. A fresh wave of tears fell from Terry's eyes as he lowered his head.
Outside the church, they surrounded us. A couple of them grabbed her and took her inside. I tried to stop them, but they held me down. I heard her screaming.
One of the bushmen standing over Terry struck him in the back of the head with a thick wooden club, sending his face toward the mud.
Leave him alone, you motherfuckers!
I shouted angrily as the other bushman left my side and began walking towards the shoreline. I knew something very bad was about to happen to Terry. That's when I had an epiphany. Up until then, I had considered Terry to be an interesting but disingenuous guy. I didn't like his dishonest lifestyle or the company he kept. He was a clever bullshitter who drove around a cream-colored Volkswagen van from the 1960s like a jackass. But despite all of that, Terry Daniels was my friend. He was my only friend. And I was about to watch my friend die a horrible, gruesome death. I could have been angry with him for getting us into this situation, and I would have been justified. But that didn't really matter now, because he was about to pay the ultimate price. The bushmen surrounded Terry, one of them grabbing a fistful of his long hair and lifting his head from the mud.
I'm so sorry.
Terry choked out as blood fell from his mouth.
Don't worry about it, man. Try to go somewhere inside your head. Try not to think about it. Please. Try not to think about it, Terry.
I knew the suggestion was moot, but I didn't know what else to say. Terry's tortured wails echoed across the lake and into the vast swampland as a stone blade scraped away the flesh from his scalp. Terry's bleeding head was then lifted upright, and with a single swing of the cudgel, his nose was completely smashed. Muffled wails emanated from his broken face as he writhed in pain. A pair of stone daggers were then plunged into his eyes. Terry convulsed wildly as his agonized screams were stifled by his own scalp being forced into his mouth.
You fucking animals. I'll come back here and kill every single one of you miserable bastards.
I shouted as Terry's mutilated body was hogtied and placed into a wooden canoe. The canoe was then pushed out into the lake, where it slowly drifted through the water. The overcast sky suddenly darkened, and a fog slithered from the surrounding trees and engulfed the lake. The canoe drifted further into the water, becoming less visible as it advanced. The antlered man raised his scepter into the air, and a bark resounded from beneath the deer's skull. The noise was followed by a low chant emanating from the other bushmen gathered at the shoreline. Their camouflaged bodies began twisting and contorting in unnatural movements. The canoe had almost vanished into the fog before several long shapes surfaced from the water. The earth shook as what can only be described as a giant hand emerged, holding the canoe. Water spilling over the shoreline, dousing the fire as a thunderous growl bellowed from the lake, causing my face to ripple. The bushmen all fell to their knees and bowed their heads. The antlered man shrieked as an enormous form emerged from the depths and rose up into the fog. A pair of titanic antlers towered above the obscured behemoth, as two glowing spheres bathed the shoreline in green light. I felt urine running down my leg as I stared up at the colossal being. The canoe was then lifted from the water. An elephant-like snort was heard as the creature's head craned backwards, revealing a maw of super fangs. Terry's body fell from the canoe and plummeted into the gullet. And just like that, Terry Daniels was gone. The massive head came back upright. Its glowing green eyes were now focused on me.
Come on, you overgrown piece of shit. Pull me out of my misery.
I spat angrily. I had reached an impasse. If I was going to be devoured by this oversized swamp thing, I would not go quietly. My insults and snarling may have been all but useless, but they made me feel brave in the face of certain death. Tunnels of green light projected from giant eyes directly toward the antlered man still upon the shore. His body twitched uncontrollably as he was bombarded by the luminescence. Soon, the light disappeared, and all fell silent. The fog crept onto the shore and surrounded me, creating an opaque blanket of gloom. Through the abyss, two glowing orbs appeared. Then, a pair of antlers came into view. The antlered man walked towards me. The haunting green light now shined from the hollow sockets of his mask.
Do your worst, motherfucker.
I growled before launching a wad of spit toward him. A hand shot out from under his grass cloak and grabbed the sides of my jaw, forcing me to look at him directly in his glowing eyes. Another hand moved the skull mask, and I gazed upon the antlered man's true face. Sickly, gray skin was stretched across bony cheeks as a row of severely decayed teeth clicked at me beneath a rotted nasal cavity. His appearance can only be compared to a decomposing corpse, with no lids to conceal the radiant eyeballs protruding from his emaciated face. Still clutching my jaw, the hand squeezed, causing pain to shoot down my neck. A raspy voice spoke, filling my nostrils with a sour stench.
You no die. You live. And tell world soon the swamp god will return.
As I stared into the orbs, I felt my consciousness slipping. And soon, all went black.
Clear!
A voice echoed in the darkness, followed by a series of bleeps.
Come on. We're losing him. Increase the voltage.
I opened my eyes to see a digital wave being sent across a screen, followed by another and another, each one resounding in a rhythmic bleep. The sight of my bare feet protruding from a green blanket under unpleasant fluorescent lighting indicated that I was in a hospital. I still have no recollection of how I ended up there. After several days of recovery, I found out that an airborne patrol discovered Terry's van by a decommissioned gate, and they dispatched a team of rangers to investigate. Once they arrived, they found my naked body lying next to the Volkswagen on the verge of death. I was immediately airlifted to a medical center in Naples. After I was well enough, I gave my statement to the police and relayed what happened out there in the swamps. I have a firm understanding of how law enforcement works. From the moment I regained my senses, I decided to withhold certain information from them. If I told them about the giant creature in the lake, it would only incriminate me. So, I told them a more digestible version of the truth. We trespassed into a restricted area of the Everglades to capture footage for a documentary when we were attacked by several camouflaged men hiding in the forest. I witnessed these attackers murder both Terry Daniels and Thomas Schroedsman. I couldn't say what happened to Lizzy Mercer, but I presume she's likely dead. My account was met with the usual skepticism and suspicion, but charges were never filed against me. When I was well enough, I accompanied them down the trail we took and led them to that old run-down church in the clearing. Despite a thorough search inside the structure and the surrounding area, which involved helicopters and police dogs, the bodies of Terry and the others were never found, and the 16mm camera I dropped outside the church was never recovered. When I finally returned to Gainesville, I wanted to apologize to Mr. Coughlin for losing the camera and was going to offer to reimburse him for it. However, during my time away, Mr. Coughlin disappeared without a trace. When the phone calls from the university went unanswered, they sent someone to go check on him. I spoke to the student who was sent to Coughlin's apartments on behalf of the school.
Yeah, no one heard from him in a while. I went over to his apartment and knocked on his door, but no one answered. So I decided to call the police. They couldn't do anything on that night because there was no missing persons report filed. So a couple of days later, they got a hold of the apartment manager and he granted them access. According to the police, it looked like no one had ever lived there. There were no personal belongings or even a single carpet stain in sight.
The university decided to launch an investigation into who exactly Mr. Coughlin was. I'm convinced that he is somehow connected to what happened to us out in the swamps, but I'm still not sure exactly how. It has been over 20 years, and I still have no answers. I don't know if this story has any valuable moral lessons for you, but at the very least, I hope that I've managed to entertain you. If I was going to leave you with any parting words, I suppose I should tell you that if you ever decide to visit the Everglades in southern Florida, be aware that somewhere along the vast swamplands and cypress trees reside a bloodthirsty cult, waiting for the next victim to enter their domain, prepared to show their devotion to a forgotten god.